There was once a king who wanted a wife, and so he spread the news all through the kingdom. And a miller who had a daughter thought to himself, I want my daughter to marry the king. And so he brought his daughter to the king, and he said, I'm a miller, and my daughter has an amazing skill. She can spin straw into gold. And the king was interested and said, really? If she really can spin straw into gold, then I'll marry her. So they put her to the test. They took the daughter to this big tower, and the king and her father put her into a room which was full of straw and a spinning wheel, and said, if you manage to turn this straw into gold, you'll save your life. If not, you're going to have your head cut off. And then they shut the door and locked her in. So the nameless daughter found herself in this room with an impossible task. At this juncture, I just want to quickly just have a bit of an aside here about what's happened so far. I remember as a child, when I first heard this story, you'll recognize it as Rumplestilzkin now. What was the father doing, saying this to the king? I mean, presumably he knew that his daughter couldn't do that, or maybe he knew something else that we don't know. Maybe she could do that. Maybe she didn't even know she could do that. But the fact that he would lie to the king in that way, because he wants the king to marry his daughter because he's poor miller and he wants his daughter to get rich for him. To say this lie, to put her into this position of having to do something completely impossible or lose her life is like a huge betrayal. So let's just think of her in this room. Already her life has been taken out of her hands. There's a bargain, a deal being done, a test that she's being made to do when she has absolutely no say or interest in any of it. But there she finds herself, as it were, between a rock and a hard place, having to perform this task, or else she's going to get her head chopped off, or else she's going to be promised this idea of marrying the king, should she be able to do this transmutation, this alchemy with straw into gold. But she's never asked to marry the king in the first place anyway. So the nameless daughter, set in this room with an impossible task, starts to cry and feel completely despairing at thinking about her situation and what's happened to her and what structure she's found herself in. And in comes, at that point of her deepest despair, a small little man. He's described in some of the versions as like an elf or a creature, but sometimes a man. He's really meant to be really small. And he comes in and he says, what's the matter? And she tells him her plight. And he says, oh, I can help you. In fact, I can save you. I can completely rescue you from this life-death situation, this impossible task that's been set before you. I can spin this straw into gold, but what will you give me? And she's like, I don't have anything. She realizes she has a necklace. So she says, you can have my necklace. And he's like, okay, I'll take that. And so he takes her necklace. It's important that, I think, about taking off a garment and giving it to him. And that night, as the fairy tale goes, the little man sits down at the spinning wheel and it always says, and the spinning wheel went whir, whir, whir. And you get given this idea of the sound of the process, a duration, a process, a night of work, which is being undertaken by this so-called helper or rescuer. In the morning, the room is full of gleaming gold. Every strand of straw has been transmuted into gold through this amazing spinning that the little man has done. And as the king and her father opens the door, the little man disappears, and there's the nameless miller's daughter surrounded by gold. And they're like, wow, that's amazing. But it's not enough for the king. He says, okay, come down the corridor. Here's another bigger room full of straw. I want you to turn that into gold by tomorrow morning, or else I'm going to chop off your head. Again, another death threat from her potential husband. And her father looks on thinking, she's going to do it, whatever he's thinking. Anyway, she's faced again with the room full of straw and with this impossible task. And she's like, oh, I can't do it. What am I going to do? And what is this situation anyway? And in comes the little man, the so-called savior, and says, you know me, I can do it. But what will you give me? I'll turn all of this straw into gold. But what will you give me? And she's like, I don't have anything. I've just got a ring. And she hands over the ring. He says, fine, I want your ring. And he takes the ring. And then he sits down at the spinning wheel. Whoa, 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 the spinning wheel goes. And he spins all this huge amount of straw into gold. And in comes her father and the king to see the wonderful, wondrous, miraculous sight of her incredible skill, so-called, of transforming the straw into gold. But it's still not enough for the king. Okay, this is the last one. He takes her down the hall to the great hall, to the biggest room in the tower, and full of straw. And he says, if you turn all of this straw into gold, I will marry you. And if you don't, I will kill you. So she goes back into her room, they lock the door, and she thinks about her situation. And this is really a rock and a hard place. If she manages to do it, then she gets to marry this king who has now threatened her life 3 times, and who she never asked to marry, and who threatens to cut off her head if she doesn't give him what he wants, the riches, the creativity, get what he wants, he will kill her. And then if she doesn't do the magic, if she doesn't make the straw gold, then he's going to cut off her head. So it's either marriage or death, which is often an equation that fairy tale and myth put together. Marriage equals death. Marriage and death sort of conjoin in many, many fairy tales. So she's thinking about her fate, this big, great hall, the last chance, and in comes the little man and says, oh, you need me again. You really need me this time. Don't worry, I can do it. But what will you give me? But this time, the nameless miller's daughter has nothing. She's given all her jewellery. She has nothing to give. And actually, in one version of the fairy tale, she actually says to him, you know what? I don't want your help. I've got nothing to give you. I don't want your help, which means implicitly she is actually affirmatively choosing death, not to transform the straw into gold, and to choose to get beheaded. That is the spinning of one fate of this story that goes through her mind. But the little man pushes and pushes and says, no, I'm going to help you. It's fine. Come on, there must be something that you can give me. I know what, if I turn this straw into gold and you marry the king and you become queen, just what you have to give me is your firstborn child. And the nameless miller's daughter thinks about it. And in one version, she's like, well, none of this seems real. I mean, she doesn't say that, but this is how I'm reading it. She says, the future's uncertain. Who knows what's going to happen? Like, the idea of having a child just isn't even reality to her, or marrying this tyrant who's threatening to cut off her head 3 times. So it all seems really unreal. So she's like, whatever, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Okay. And says yes, and agrees to this sinister bargain that the so-called rescuer and helper is coercing her into. And so that night, the little man spins the whole great hall, all of the straw into gold. And in the morning, the king and the father come in and they rejoice. She's passed all of the tests. And the king says, okay, look, I have seen you are amazing. You have the most miraculously capacity to do this incredible spinning into gold. I'm going to marry you and make you queen. And then a year later, after she has to be his queen, we don't know what happens within that year, but she produces, as it says in the tale, a beautiful baby daughter. And she's happy and she produces this beautiful child. And along comes the man and says, that's mine. Give the child to me. Remember the bargain you promised. And she's absolutely distraught. She's absolutely distressed. She has a breakdown. She's like, do not make me do this. You can have all the gold in the world. You can have anything you want, but not this. I'll give you all my riches. And the little man says, I don't need gold. I don't need wealth. I don't need riches. Don't you remember me? I'm the one that can spin the straw into gold. I want the live creature. And it says in when you read different versions of it, some of it says, I want the live baby, I want the live child, or I want the live creature. I don't want gold, I don't want wealth, I want the live creature. So there's something about this capacity for creativity that the little man wants more. He can spin straw into gold, but he wants the live, the real thing, which is more than gold, the live creature, the baby. And she's absolutely distraught, and she cries, and he pities her. And this is the bit in the myth which is kind of strange, in that he suddenly becomes, perhaps has empathy, because he's like, okay, look, I'm going to give you 3 days. If you can guess my name in 3 days, then I will let you keep your daughter, let you keep your child. And off he goes. And she's like thinking, his name, how am I going to know his name? And she spends 3 days sort of thinking, researching, racking her brains, asking everyone, doing as much as research as she can to try and find out this man's name. She goes through all of the names, and the first day he comes and she says all the names, and he says, no, that's not my name. The second day she finds out all these other names, and he says, no, sorry, that's also not my name. And on the third day, she's absolutely desperate, and she goes off into the forest on her own, and has spent a day and a night, the last day and the night, going into the heart of the forest on a journey, really trying to discover this name. And in the fairy tale, it says that she suddenly heard this man singing a song where he says something like, the baby's going to be mine, the baby's going to be mine, ha ha ha, and Rumplestilzkin is my name. And she hears that, and she's like, she's heard the name. And she goes back thinking, I've got it, I found it, I know it. And he comes, and she says, first of all, she says other names twice, just to sort of lead him on. And then finally, at the last moment, so this is your last chance to keep your child. What's my name? And she says, is Rumplestilzkin your name? And as she says the word, he gets so angry. A rage rises up through him, so high and so passionate that it breaks him in half. He stamps his foot, actually, and the stamp of the foot splits his body, and he gets destroyed and ripped into two, and then gets swallowed back into the earth, and she's free. So this last bit of the myth is really interesting, isn't it? Like, first of all, this 3 days that's opened up in the myth. Now, those 3 days, 3 is a number that appears ubiquitously in myth and fairy tale. And in this one already, you can see she has 3 nights where she has to spin the 3 different rooms of straw into gold. And then there's 3 days to try and find out his name. 3 days is interesting because it reminds me of the ancient Sumerian myth of Inanna, which I'll talk about at some point later in another video, where Inanna chooses to go down into the underworld to discover what it is to die. And she spends 3 days in the underworld, and then she resurrects, she comes alive again. Similarly, as we know, Jesus does the same thing. So he after his death, he has 3 days in the underworld, in the underworld. I don't know where he went in those 3 days, but certainly he resurrects after 3 days. So this 3 days is usually a period of kind of intense sacred resurrection, transformation type time in myth and fairy tale. And the miller's daughter goes into the forest. She goes into the forests are always a motif in fairy tale of the unconscious, or of secrets, or secret knowledge, or transformation, danger and pleasure, a kind of area of intense unconscious transformations and discoveries, and she goes into the heart of darkness, as it were, into the heart of the forest, and it's there that she receives the knowledge. She hears the word Rumplestilzkin. In a way, she goes into the underworld to find the wisdom, into her unconscious, perhaps into an unknown space of her mind, and finds that actually she hears the word and comes back and says this word. And it's really interesting that it's a word that frees her from this structure of transactional, violent relationships where she is an object, nameless object of exchange between men, rescuers who want to coerce her into an indebtedness which causes her to have to give up everything and her daughter, a father that hands her over to a tyrant king who threatens to cut off her head should she not produce what he wants. These sorts of transactional economies of exchange that relationships are following in this myth. But it's when she can find the right word, a word that no one has ever heard before in the world, an unknown word, a new word, when she can go into herself, into the forest and find out this word, she can come back and dispel the structure of transactional symbolic order, as it were, and she stands free. The word frees her, and she can become a subject and have a name. In some senses, you could argue that the name Rumplestilzkin is her name, or the name of a new order in which the structure of exchange no longer trapped the woman as the miller's daughter was trapped. And so, in a way, this is a myth of a, you could see it as a coming of age myth, but it's much more than that. It's a taking back your name myth. It's a taking back your creativity, that maybe in the end, what the father knew in the beginning was that actually this daughter did have this miraculous creative capacity of this kind of alchemical creative possibility to transform straw into gold, to spin her own fate, as it were, to spin her own straw into gold, to produce her own story in her own name. Perhaps he did know that. Because otherwise, why would he even said that? So it's a betrayal, yes, but also maybe the father knew something, that actually she did have that creativity. Yes, he wanted to cash in on it, but the little man that comes along, it could be actually the part of herself that has been split off or made inaccessible to her, which is actually her own power, her own creativity to make the transformation and spin her own fate, as was when she walked into the forest. It was her who heard the word, who could dispel this structure that trapped her. And in fact, what she gets at the end is the new word and the capacity to know that she can turn straw into gold in such a way that she can spin her own fate and make her own name, and finally be reborn, be resurrected after those 3 days into a subject position, and can keep her daughter and look at the new world outside of that structure of exchange, a brave new world. Thank you.